In the annals of human history, few events have shaped the course of civilization as profoundly as the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919, misnamed the Spanish flu. This invisible enemy swept across the globe with unprecedented fury, infecting an estimated 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's entire population at the time. Unlike typical seasonal flu that primarily claimed the elderly and infirm, this virus hunted the young and healthy with particular vengeance, turning robust adults into corpses within days. The pandemic erupted during the final year of World War I, when millions of soldiers were packed into trenches and transport ships, creating perfect conditions for viral transmission. Yet this plague would prove far deadlier than the war itself, claiming between 50 to 100 million lives worldwide, more deaths than the 4 years of brutal conflict that had already devastated Europe. In the United States alone, life expectancy dropped by 12 years. Entire families were wiped out. Cities ran out of coffins. Mass graves became commonplace. What made this pandemic particularly terrifying was medicine's complete helplessness against it. Antibiotics wouldn't be discovered for another decade. The viral nature of influenza remained unknown. Doctors could only watch as their patients turned blue-black with pneumonia and died gasping for breath. Public health measures, quarantine, isolation, mask wearing, school closures, were humanity's only weapons against an enemy they couldn't see or understand. This is the story of one doctor who lived through it all, who witnessed the collapse of medical certainty and the triumph of human resilience. It's a story of 3 devastating waves, of communities torn apart and rebuilt, of the moment when modern medicine confronted its own limitations and emerged forever changed. So get comfortable tonight. Settle in somewhere quiet where you can truly listen, because this story, this journey through humanity's darkest pandemic hour, deserves your full attention. This is what it was really like to be a healer, when healing seemed impossible. Your hands are steady as you wash them in the basin, the familiar ritual of carbolic soap and hot water that begins every day at Boston General Hospital, March 1918. The morning light filters through tall windows, casting long shadows across the ward where soldiers recover from training injuries and the occasional case of seasonal flu. The Great War rages across the Atlantic, but here in Massachusetts, medicine still feels predictable, manageable. You've been practicing for 8 years now, graduated from Harvard Medical School with honors, trained under some of the finest physicians in New England. You know how to set bones, treat pneumonia, deliver babies, and comfort the dying. Your black leather medical bag contains the tools of your trade: stethoscope, thermometer, morphine for pain, digitalis for heart conditions, aspirin for fever. These instruments and medications represent the cutting edge of modern medicine in 1918. The hospital corridors buzz with their usual morning energy. Nurses in starched white uniforms and caps move efficiently between patients, their shoes clicking against polished floors. The head nurse, Margaret O'Sullivan, a formidable Irish woman who's run these wards for 15 years, briefs you on the overnight admissions. 3 soldiers from Camp Devons with what appears to be influenza, she reports matter-of-factly. Nothing unusual. You examine the first patient, Private William Henderson, a strapping 22-year-old from Ohio with fever, chills, and body aches. His pulse is elevated but strong, breathing slightly laboured but not alarming. Classic influenza presentation. You prescribe bed rest, fluids, and aspirin. You'll be back on your feet in a week, you tell him, with the confidence born of medical training and experience. He manages a weak smile, grateful for your reassurance. The second patient, Corporal James Murphy, from Boston's South End, presents similarly. Irish immigrant family, worked in the shipyards before enlisting, healthy as a horse according to his military records. The fever has him shivering despite the heavy wool blankets. You listen to his lungs, some congestion, but nothing that suggests serious pneumonia. Another routine case of seasonal flu, you conclude. But as you approach the third bed, something makes you pause. Sergeant Michael Torres, a Puerto Rican soldier who'd been training at Camp Devons, lies motionless except for the rapid rise and fall of his chest. His breathing is shallow, quick, almost desperate. When you lift his eyelids, you notice something that makes your stomach tighten. A slight blue tinge around his lips and fingernails. Cyanosis. His oxygen levels are dropping. You place your stethoscope against his chest and hear the telltale crackling that indicates fluid in the lungs. Pneumonia, developing rapidly. This concerns you, but pneumonia is a known complication of influenza, especially in military populations living in close quarters. You increase his supportive care, arrange for closer monitoring, and make a mental note to check on him more frequently. What you don't know, what no one in the world knows yet, is that you've just encountered one of the earliest cases of what will become the most devastating pandemic in human history. The virus currently replicating in Sergeant Torres's lungs will soon spread with explosive force, first through military camps, then civilian populations, eventually circling the globe multiple times in waves of destruction that will reshape human society. The morning passes normally. You make rounds, review charts, consult with colleagues about challenging cases. Dr. Edmund Richards, the hospital's chief of medicine, stops by your ward to discuss the soldiers' cases. Probably brought something back from camp, he says, stroking his grey beard thoughtfully. These military facilities are breeding grounds for respiratory illness. Keep an eye on them, but I expect they'll recover normally. You nod in agreement. Why wouldn't you? Every medical textbook, every lecture you attended, every case you've treated has taught you that influenza, while unpleasant, rarely kills healthy young adults. The dangerous cases are always the very young, the very old, the already weakened. These soldiers are the picture of health and vitality. By afternoon, Private Henderson is sitting up in bed, chatting with a visitor. His fever has broken, and he's asking when he can return to duty. Corporal Murphy is also improving, though more slowly. But Sergeant Torres is getting worse. His breathing has become more laboured, the blue tinge around his lips more pronounced. You order additional treatments, steam inhalations, mustard plasters, all the remedies in your arsenal for respiratory distress. That evening, as you prepare to leave the hospital, you stop by his bed one final time. His wife Maria has arrived from their small apartment in Jamaica Plain. She's young, probably not yet 20, with dark hair pinned beneath a simple hat and worry etched in every line of her face. She speaks to him in rapid Spanish, holding his hand tightly. "How is he, doctor?" she asks in accented English. "Will he recover?" You want to give her the same confident reassurance you offered Private Henderson, but something about this case feels different. Still, you have no reason to believe this is anything more than a severe case of influenza, with complicating pneumonia. "We're doing everything we can," you tell her. "He's young and strong. That's in his favour." She nods, but tears glisten in her eyes. "He was fine yesterday morning," she whispers, laughing, joking with the other soldiers. How can someone become so sick so quickly? It's a question you'll hear thousands of times in the coming months. How can healthy young people deteriorate so rapidly? How can a virus that usually causes minor illness suddenly become a mass killer? How can modern medicine, which has made such remarkable advances, prove so completely helpless against an invisible enemy? But tonight, you don't know to ask those questions yet. Tonight, you simply squeeze Maria's shoulder gently and promise to check on her husband first thing in the morning. You walk home through Boston's gaslit streets, past families eating dinner in warm kitchens, past children playing on stoops, past the normal rhythms of a society that has no idea how dramatically it's about to change. The next morning, Sergeant Michael Torres becomes the first influenza fatality you'll witness. He won't be the last. The telegram arrives on a Tuesday morning while you're examining a patient with suspected appendicitis. Nurse O'Sullivan hands it to you with a frown, her Irish accent thick with concern. It's from Camp Devons, doctor, marked urgent. You tear open the yellow envelope and read the brief message twice, certain you've misunderstood. Dr. Roy Grist, the camp's chief medical officer, is requesting immediate assistance. What he describes defies medical logic. Hundreds of soldiers falling ill simultaneously, not with ordinary flu, but with something far more virulent. These men start with nothing more than what appears to be an ordinary attack of La Grippe, the telegram reads, and, when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face. Gyanosis, the same blue-black discoloration you witnessed in Sergeant Torres before his death 3 weeks ago. But hundreds of cases? Simultaneously? You telegraph back immediately, offering to travel to Camp Devons within the day. Dr. Richards initially objects, Boston General, needs all available physicians, but the urgency in Dr. Grist's subsequent communications convinces him to spare you for a week-long consultation. The train ride to Ayer, Massachusetts, takes 2 hours, winding through the New England countryside, where spring is finally asserting itself after a brutal winter. Apple trees bloom pink and white against green hills. Farmers work their fields behind teams of horses. Children wave from farmhouse windows. The peaceful pastoral scene makes the medical emergency you're rushing toward seem almost surreal. Camp Devons sprawls across thousands of acres, a hastily constructed city of wooden barracks, housing 45,000 soldiers preparing for deployment to France. As your taxi approaches the main gate, you notice something immediately wrong. The usual bustle of military training has been replaced by an eerie quiet. Few soldiers are visible on the parade grounds. Those you do see move with the careful deliberation of people trying not to collapse. Dr. Roy Grist meets you at the base hospital, a tall, thin man with prematurely grey hair and eyes that haven't slept in days. His white coat is rumpled, stained with the evidence of too many medical emergencies handled without time to change clothes. He grips your hand with desperate gratitude. "Thank God you've come," he says, leading you toward the hospital buildings. "We've never seen anything like this. Never. In 30 years of practicing medicine, I thought I'd encountered every variety of respiratory illness. But this..." He shakes his head helplessly. The hospital, designed to accommodate 1,200 patients, now holds over 6,000. Every bed is occupied. Many soldiers lying on stretchers in hallways, some on blankets spread across floors. The sound hits you first, a constant symphony of coughing, laboured breathing, and moans of pain. The smell follows. Disinfectant failing to mask the odours of illness, death, and human suffering on an industrial scale. You follow Dr. Grist through ward after ward of desperately sick young men. These aren't the elderly or infirm you'd expect to see devastated by influenza. These are soldiers in their teens and 20s, men who arrived at camp in peak physical condition. Now they lie dying with the characteristic blue-black cyanosis of severe pneumonia, their bodies unable to absorb adequate oxygen despite desperate gasping. The onset is incredibly rapid, Dr. Grist explains. As you examine patient after patient, a soldier will report for sick call in the morning with slight fever and malaise. By afternoon, he's coughing up blood-tinged sputum. By evening, he's struggling to breathe. Many die within 48 hours of first symptoms. You listen to lungs filled with fluid, take pulses that race frantically as hearts try to compensate for failing respiratory systems, observe temperatures that spike to dangerous levels before plummeting as bodies shut down. Nothing in your medical training has prepared you for the sheer scale of this catastrophe or the complete inadequacy of available treatments. What have you tried, you ask, though you already know the limitations of 1,918 medicine? Everything, doctor, Grist replies wearily. Steam inhalations, mustard plasters, bloodletting, purgatives, high doses of aspirin, quinine, strychnine as a stimulant. We've even tried some of the new serums developed for pneumonia, but they seem completely ineffective against whatever pathogen we're dealing with. You spend the next several days working around the clock, trying every treatment in the medical arsenal. Nothing works. Soldiers continue dying at an appalling rate, sometimes over 100 per day. The camp's morgue, designed for perhaps 2 bodies, overflows with corpses stacked like cordwood. Carpenters work frantically to build coffins, but they can't keep pace with demand. What disturbs you most is the demographic pattern. Unlike typical influenza, which primarily kills the very young and very old, this virus seems to target healthy adults between ages 20 and 40 with particular ferocity. It's as if the strength of their immune systems somehow works against them, triggering catastrophic inflammatory responses that destroy lung tissue. On your 4th night at Camp Devons, you sit in the officers' mess with Dr. Grist and several other military physicians, trying to make sense of what you've witnessed. The conversation is hushed, almost fearful. Could this be a new strain of influenza? Asks Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female physicians at the camp. Something we've never encountered before? Or biological warfare? Suggests Captain Robert Hayes, the camp's epidemiologist. The Germans have been experimenting with weaponized diseases. Maybe this is their newest creation. You shake your head. If this were biological warfare, why would it first appear at an American military base? And why haven't we seen similar outbreaks reported from German positions? The truth, which you're all beginning to recognize, but reluctant to voice, is that you're confronting something beyond current medical understanding. This isn't just a bad flu season. This is a completely novel pathogen, one that breaks all the established rules about influenza behavior and mortality patterns. Doctor, Grist pulls out a telegram he received that afternoon. It's not just us, he says quietly. Similar outbreaks are being reported from military installations across the country. Camp Upton in New York, Camp Grant in Illinois, even some naval facilities. Whatever this is, it's spreading. That night, you lie awake in your temporary quarters, listening to the sounds of illness echoing from the hospital buildings. Through your window, you can see lights burning throughout the medical complex as doctors and nurses work through another endless night. The spring air carries the scent of apple blossoms, mixed with the smoke from the crematory that's been running continuously for days. You think about your comfortable practice back in Boston, your confident diagnoses, your assured bedside manner. That world of medical certainty suddenly feels very far away. You've just witnessed the opening act of what will become history's deadliest pandemic, though you don't know it yet. You've seen modern medicine fail completely against a microscopic enemy, though the germ theory of disease won't be fully understood for years to come. What you do know with growing dread, is that if this illness spreads beyond military camps into civilian populations, the consequences could be catastrophic. In your medical bag, you carry a small notebook where you've been recording observations about this mysterious disease. The final entry from your week at Camp Devons reads simply, "Pray this remains contained within military installations. If it reaches our cities, God help us all." Within days, your prayer will prove futile. The Spanish flu is about to escape into the wider world. The second wave hits Boston like a tsunami of death. You wake on the 8th of September to the sound of church bells tolling continuously across the city, not calling people to worship, but marking the passing of souls at a rate that overwhelms the normal funeral rituals. From your bedroom window, you can see smoke rising from 3 different directions, where emergency crematoriums work around the clock to handle bodies that the city's morgues can no longer accommodate. 5 months have passed since your visit to Camp Devons. 5 months during which you allowed yourself to hope that the spring outbreak had been an isolated military phenomenon. How wrong you were. The virus that seemed to fade during the summer months has returned with exponential fury, spreading through civilian populations with horrifying efficiency. Your morning walk to Boston General takes you through streets transformed into something resembling a medieval plague city. Storefronts bear hastily painted signs: "Closed due to illness," "No public gatherings," "Keep windows open." The few people you encounter wear improvised masks, scraps of cloth, handkerchiefs, anything that might provide protection against an invisible enemy. They avoid eye contact, cross streets to maintain distance, eye every cough with terror. At the hospital, Nurse O'Sullivan meets you at the entrance with a clipboard thick with overnight admissions. Her face, usually ruddy with good health and Irish temperament, appears gaunt and pale. Dark circles under her eyes suggest she's been working double shifts, as have most of the staff who haven't yet fallen ill themselves. "We lost 3 more nurses overnight," she reports, in a voice professionally calm, despite the personal grief underneath. "Catherine Murphy from paediatrics, Ellen Walsh from surgery, and," her voice catches slightly, "young Mary Flanagan from obstetrics. She was only 23, doctor. Just graduated nursing school last year." The hospital corridors echo with the same symphony of suffering you first encountered at Camp Devons, but magnified tenfold. Every bed holds a patient gasping for breath. Stretchers line hallways, occupied by victims waiting for beds that may never become available. The elevator has been converted into a temporary treatment area. Even the hospital chapel houses overflow patients, creating a grotesque parody of sanctuary. You begin rounds with the systematic efficiency born of medical training, but the scale of catastrophe quickly overwhelms any pretense of normal practice. Patient after patient presents with the same horrifying progression: fever, severe body aches, then rapid deterioration into pneumonia, accompanied by the characteristic blue-black cyanosis that marks oxygen starvation. In the men's ward, you examine Thomas O'Brien, a dock worker from South Boston. Yesterday, he was loading ships bound for Europe. This morning, he can barely speak through fluid-filled lungs. His wife, Patricia, holds his hand while their 3 young children wait in the hallway, their faces pressed against the glass door like prisoners watching their father die. "Will he recover, doctor?" Patricia asks, with the desperate hope of someone who already knows the answer, but needs to hear medical authority contradict her fears. You want to lie, to offer comfort, but the blue tinge around Thomas's lips tells the truth more honestly than any words you might speak. "We're doing everything possible," you reply, the inadequate phrase you've repeated hundreds of times over the past weeks. "He's receiving the best care available. What you don't say is that the best care available amounts to little more than supportive comfort. Aspirin for fever, steam inhalations for congestion, morphine for pain, and prayer for miracles that medicine cannot provide. The bacterial pneumonia that often develops secondary to influenza might respond to treatments, but the viral infection itself remains beyond the reach of 1,918 medical science. 3 beds down, you encounter a case that challenges every assumption about influenza mortality patterns. Eleanor Hastings, a prominent Boston socialite, lies dying at age 28. She was perfectly healthy 3 days ago, hosting a charity luncheon for European war relief. Her husband, a successful banker, has spared no expense seeking the finest medical care Boston can provide, but money proves powerless against viral infection. What's most disturbing is the demographic pattern emerging across all your patients. Unlike typical seasonal flu, this pandemic virus kills the young and healthy with particular efficiency. Your wards hold soldiers home from training camps, factory workers, teachers, shopkeepers, the productive heart of society between ages 18 and 40. The elderly, who typically suffer most from respiratory illness, often experience milder symptoms or recover completely. Dr. Edmund Richards finds you during your afternoon break, smoking a cigarette on the hospital's rear loading dock where ambulances arrive in constant procession. Even this supposedly private space offers no escape from the pandemic's reality. You can hear the sounds of suffering through every open window, see the endless stream of bodies being removed to make room for new patients. The mayor's called an emergency meeting, Doctor. Richards informs you, his usually commanding voice reduced to exhausted monotone. They want medical professionals to advise on public health measures, theatre closures, school cancellations, restrictions on public gatherings. Some cities have banned funerals entirely. Too many people dying, too much risk of spreading infection. You nod, understanding the logic, while recognizing its bitter irony. The very social structures that usually help communities cope with tragedy, religious services, funeral rites, family gatherings, must be abandoned to prevent even greater tragedy. Society is being forced to mourn in isolation, to face death without the comfort of traditional communal support. That evening's emergency meeting takes place in Boston City Hall's main chamber, though only half the expected attendees arrive. Several city councilmen have fallen ill. The police chief's entire family is quarantined, and 2 members of the Board of Health died over the weekend. Those present sit far apart from each other, many wearing masks, all eyeing their colleagues with barely concealed suspicion. Anyone might be carrying the virus. Everyone is a potential vector of death. Mayor Andrew Peters looks haggard as he calls the meeting to order. Gentlemen, he begins, then corrects himself with a nod toward Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female physicians in attendance. Gentleman and lady, we face an unprecedented crisis. Our city is dying faster than we can bury the dead. I need to know what medical science can tell us about stopping this plague. The silence that follows his question speaks volumes about medicine's helplessness. Finally, you stand to address the group. Mr. Mayor, the honest answer is that we don't fully understand what we're fighting. This influenza strain behaves unlike anything in medical literature. It kills the young and healthy while sparing many elderly patients. It spreads with extraordinary efficiency. One infected person can transmit the disease to dozens of others before showing symptoms. You pause, looking around the chamber at faces that reflect the same exhaustion and fear you see in the mirror each morning. The only effective interventions available to us are the same measures humans have used against plague for centuries. Isolation of the sick, quarantine of the exposed, and reduction of human contact through cancellation of public gatherings. The city's public health officer, Dr. William Woodward, adds his voice to yours. We must close schools, theatres, churches, dance halls, any venue where people congregate in large numbers. We should require masks in public spaces, though their effectiveness remains unproven. Most importantly, we need to educate the public about basic hygiene hand washing, covering coughs, avoiding contact with obviously sick individuals. What follows is a heated debate about the economic and social costs of such measures. Business owners argue that closing commercial establishments will destroy livelihoods. Religious leaders insist that people need spiritual comfort during crisis. School administrators worry about children's education being disrupted. But the statistics you present overwhelm all objections. In the past 2 weeks, Boston has recorded over 3,000 deaths from influenza, more than the city typically sees from all causes combined in an entire month. The death rate is accelerating daily. Without drastic intervention, the pandemic could kill 10% or more of the city's population. By meeting's end, the decision is made. Boston will join other major American cities in implementing comprehensive social distancing measures. Schools close indefinitely. Churches suspend services. Theatres, dance halls, and bars shut down. Even weddings and funerals face severe restrictions on attendance. You walk home through streets that seem increasingly apocalyptic. Quarantine signs mark house after house, where entire families lie sick or dying. The few pedestrians you encounter hurry past without acknowledgement, wrapped in coats and scarves, despite the mild September weather, desperate to avoid any contact that might transmit infection. At home, you sit at your kitchen table and write letters to medical colleagues in other cities, sharing observations about the pandemic's progression and the complete inadequacy of available treatments. Your correspondence with physicians in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and San Francisco reveals the same horrifying pattern everywhere. Hospitals overwhelmed, medical staff dying, communities paralyzed by fear. One letter from Dr. James Morrison in Philadelphia particularly disturbs you. The situation here defies description, he writes. Bodies pile up faster than we can dispose of them. The city has requisitioned steam shovels to dig mass graves. Children wander streets looking for parents who have died, and entire neighborhoods stand empty. I've begun to wonder if civilization itself can survive this plague. As you prepare for bed, you realize you haven't seen or spoken to your own family in over a week. Your sister Margaret lives just across town with her husband and 2 young children, but the risk of inadvertently carrying infection to them keeps you away. The loneliness of medical practice during a pandemic, surrounded by people but isolated from personal connection, adds psychological trauma to the physical exhaustion of endless medical crises. Outside your window, Boston settles into another night of suffering. Tomorrow will bring fresh horrors, new patients, more deaths. But tonight, for just a few hours, you allow yourself the luxury of sleep, knowing that your strength must be conserved for the battles ahead. The worst is yet to come. October 1918 becomes the month that breaks medicine's back. You wake each morning to a city that seems increasingly medieval in its helplessness against plague. From your apartment window, you can see smoke rising continuously from hastily constructed crematoriums, mixing with the autumn mist to create an atmosphere that feels apocalyptic. The death toll has reached numbers that render individual tragedy meaningless. Over 1,000 Bostonians are dying every week, and the rate continues accelerating. Your own appearance reflects the toll of treating an untreatable disease. The mirror shows a man aged years in mere weeks' hollow cheeks, dark circles under bloodshot eyes, hands that shake slightly from exhaustion and too much coffee. Your black medical coat, once a symbol of professional authority and healing power, now feels more like a funeral shroud worn by a gravedigger. The walk to Boston General takes you through neighborhoods that seem abandoned by civilization itself. Entire blocks of houses display quarantine signs, their windows closed despite health department recommendations for fresh air circulation. The few shops that remain open serve customers through doorways, proprietors wearing homemade masks, and maintaining careful distance from patrons who might carry death in their breath. At the hospital, the situation has deteriorated beyond anything imaginable in peacetime. Every available space holds patients' hallways, storage rooms, the hospital chapel. Even the morgue basement has been converted to overflow wards. The elevator shaft serves as a vertical hospital room with patients on stretchers stacked at each floor landing. The sound of collective suffering, coughing, laboured breathing, weeping creates a constant background symphony of human misery. Nurse O'Sullivan meets you at the main entrance, her usual morning briefing now delivered while walking because standing still wastes precious time. "We lost 18 patients overnight," she reports matter-of-factly, her Irish accent muted by exhaustion, including Dr. Morrison from internal medicine and 2 more nurses from pediatrics. The pediatric ward. Her voice falters momentarily. The children are dying faster than we can comfort them. You pause at this news about Dr. Morrison, a colleague and friend who'd been treating influenza patients since the second wave began. He was 35 years old, married with 2 young daughters, seemingly healthy until the virus found him. His death illustrates the pandemic's most terrifying characteristic: medical knowledge provides no protection against an enemy that medicine cannot defeat. Your first stop is the children's ward, where the sight that greets you challenges every assumption about childhood resilience. Tiny patients, some barely old enough to walk, struggle for breath in beds too large for their small bodies. Unlike typical influenza patterns, this virus kills children with horrifying efficiency, often within 24 hours of symptom onset. You examine 6-year-old Michael Sullivan, whose parents brought him to the hospital yesterday with what seemed like ordinary flu symptoms. Now he lies unconscious, his small face bearing the blue-black cyanosis that marks severe oxygen deprivation. His breathing comes in desperate gasps as his tiny lungs fill with fluid. Your stethoscope reveals the crackling sounds of pneumonia that has developed with supernatural speed. Standing beside his bed, his mother Catherine maintains a vigil that has continued through the night. Her husband Patrick died 3 days ago, also from influenza, leaving her to face the possible loss of their only child while dealing with her own grief. When she looks at you with desperate hope for some medical miracle, you struggle to maintain professional composure. "Is there nothing more you can do?" she pleads, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some new treatment, some medicine that might help him fight this terrible sickness?" The honest answer that modern medicine offers nothing effective against viral influenza seems too cruel to voice. Instead, you adjust his positioning to ease breathing, increase his morphine dosage to reduce suffering, and arrange for more frequent monitoring. These actions provide the illusion of medical intervention, while acknowledging the reality of medical helplessness. 3 beds away, you encounter a case that illustrates the pandemic's bizarre demographic targeting. 8-year-old Sarah Cohen lies dying while her grandmother, 72-year-old Rebecca Cohen, sits beside her bed, looking tired but healthy. The elderly woman contracted influenza a week ago experienced mild symptoms for 3 days, then recovered completely. Her granddaughter, who caught the virus from her, is dying despite being young, previously healthy, and receiving the same medical care. "I don't understand," Rebecca whispers to you in accented English, her weathered hands stroking Sarah's fever-hot forehead. In the old country, when sickness came, it took the weak ones, the old, the babies, those already sick. But this, she gestures helplessly at her dying granddaughter, this takes our strongest children and leaves old women like me. Her observation captures the pandemic's most disturbing feature. Unlike typical infectious diseases that follow predictable patterns of mortality, this influenza strain seems to target the body's immune system itself, turning biological strength into fatal weakness. The cytokine storm, though you don't yet have that term, causes robust immune systems to overreact, destroying lung tissue in attempts to fight viral infection. Moving through adult wards, you encounter the same pattern of medical futility, repeated with endless variation. Young factory workers, who were lifting heavy machinery last week now, can barely lift their hands to drink water. Teachers who were energetically managing classrooms of children lie dying while their elderly mothers recover from the same disease. In the men's medical ward, you spend time with James McKenna, a 28-year-old firefighter who caught influenza while responding to emergency calls in neighborhoods devastated by the pandemic. His physical strength, which allowed him to carry victims from burning buildings, now works against him as his immune system launches a catastrophic assault on his own lung tissue. His wife Mary sits beside his bed, 8 months pregnant with their first child. She's already recovered from her own bout with influenza, one of the fortunate ones who experienced only mild symptoms, but now faces the possibility of losing her husband just weeks before becoming a mother. The cruel irony of survival and death, distributed apparently at random, adds psychological torment to the pandemic's physical devastation. Will the baby be safe? Mary asks you during one of your examinations of her husband. If James doesn't survive, can I raise a child alone during times like these? The question forces you to confront the pandemic's broader social consequences. Beyond individual medical tragedies, the disease is destroying family structures, leaving orphaned children and widowed spouses throughout the community. Social support systems that normally help people cope with loss have collapsed under the weight of universal suffering. Your afternoon rounds take you to the hospital's makeshift psychiatric ward, hastily established to handle the growing number of patients whose minds have broken under pandemic stress. The influenza virus itself sometimes affects the nervous system, causing delirium and psychological symptoms, but many cases result from the trauma of watching entire families die while feeling helpless to save them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few psychiatrists in Boston, tries to explain the psychological dimensions of the pandemic. We're seeing complete mental breakdowns in previously stable individuals, she reports. Parents who've lost multiple children, medical professionals who feel guilty about their inability to heal patients, ordinary citizens who've watched their communities disintegrate. The mind isn't designed to process death on this scale. Her words resonate with your own experience. How many times this month have you delivered fatal diagnoses to families? How many deathbed scenes have you witnessed? How many times have patients or family members looked to you for hope that medical training cannot provide? The emotional toll of practicing medicine during a pandemic, where medicine fails, accumulates like a poison in your psychological system. As evening approaches, you participate in the hospital's daily death review, a grim accounting of lives lost over the past 24 hours. The number has reached 48, nearly 2 deaths per hour around the clock. The morgue exceeded capacity weeks ago, forcing the hospital to use refrigerated trucks parked behind the building to store bodies awaiting burial or cremation. Dr. Richards, the hospital's chief of medicine, looks older than his 55 years as he reviews mortality statistics. "We're losing the war," he says quietly to the assembled medical staff. "Not just individual battles against disease, but the larger war between civilization and chaos. If this continues much longer, we'll have more bodies than ways to dispose of them, more patients than beds to hold them, more suffering than human compassion can address." The meeting dissolves into exhausted silence. Outside, Boston settles into another night of unprecedented dying. Church bells no longer toll for individual deaths. There are too many, and many bell ringers have themselves succumbed to the pandemic. Instead, an eerie quiet settles over a city where normal social functions have ceased and survival has become the only priority. Walking home through empty streets, you pass houses where entire families have died, their front doors marked with official notices warning against entry due to contamination risk. Other homes display hastily written signs in windows. "Help needed, children alone, food please." The social fabric that binds communities together has frayed to the breaking point. At home, you sit at your kitchen table and attempt to write medical notes about the day's cases. But the futility of documenting failures overwhelms your professional discipline. What's the point of recording treatments that don't work, symptoms that can't be relieved, patients who die despite receiving the best care 1,918 medicine can provide? Instead, you write in your personal journal, "October has become a month of medical confession. We who swore to first do no harm find ourselves unable to do any good. We who promised to heal must instead simply witness suffering and document death." The pandemic has revealed the enormous gap between medical ambition and medical capability. We are not healers. We are simply fellow humans, equally vulnerable to forces beyond our understanding or control. The afternoon brings news that illustrates both progress and ongoing challenges. Boston's public health department, reduced to a skeleton staff during the pandemic's peak, announces plans to reopen one elementary school as an experiment in resuming normal social functions. The school will operate under strict health protocols, reduced class sizes, mandatory mask wearing, daily health inspections, but its opening represents the first step toward rebuilding educational institutions. However, the challenges are enormous. Many potential teachers died during the pandemic, and others remain too traumatized or physically compromised to return to work. Many children have been without formal education for 6 months, creating learning deficits that will require years to address. Most significantly, many children are now orphaned and living in temporary arrangements that make consistent school attendance impossible. You volunteer to serve on the medical committee, evaluating which children are healthy enough to attend school safely. The screening process reveals the pandemic's lasting impact on child development. Many young survivors show signs of malnutrition, not from lack of food, but from stress and trauma that affected their ability to eat properly during crisis months. Others exhibit behavioral problems, excessive fearfulness, regression to earlier developmental stages, difficulty separating from caregivers. 8-year-old Michael Kowalski, whose entire family died except for his elderly grandmother, illustrates these developmental challenges. Before the pandemic, he was an outgoing child who excelled in school and enjoyed playing with friends. Now he speaks only in whispers, refuses to leave his grandmother's side, and shows terror when asked to interact with other children. "I'm afraid that if I go to school, grandmother will die while I'm gone," he confides during the medical evaluation, his small hands gripping tightly to his grandmother's weathered fingers. Everyone else died when I wasn't watching them. I have to stay close to make sure nothing bad happens to her. His psychological state reflects the trauma experienced by many child survivors who developed hypervigilance and separation anxiety after witnessing the sudden deaths of parents and siblings. Educational recovery will require not just academic instruction, but intensive emotional support to help children process trauma that no child should experience. The evening brings an unexpected development that provides genuine cause for hope. Father Michael O'Connor, the priest who performed countless last rites during the pandemic's worst months, announces that several churches will begin holding modified religious services. These services will accommodate reduced congregations, require mask wearing, and limit physical contact. But they represent the first step toward restoring spiritual community that many people desperately need. People require more than physical survival. Father O'Connor explains during a visit to the hospital, where he continues ministering to patients. They need meaning, purpose, connection to something larger than individual existence. The pandemic challenged everyone's faith, including my own, but perhaps that makes faith more precious when we manage to find it again. His words resonate with your own experience of practicing medicine during months when healing seemed impossible. Professional identity requires not just technical knowledge, but also sense of purpose and effectiveness. The pandemic stripped away medical confidence, just as it challenged religious faith, leaving practitioners to rediscover meaning in work that often felt futile. As February progresses, you begin noticing subtle changes in your own psychological state. The constant anxiety that characterized earlier pandemic months, fear of infection, dread about arriving at the hospital each morning, despair about medicine's limitations gradually gives way to something resembling normal professional concern. You still worry about patients, but the worry feels manageable rather than overwhelming. This psychological recovery parallels the community's gradual healing process. People begin venturing outside more regularly, though still maintaining careful distance from others. Conversations between neighbours resume, though often focused on memorial rather than future planning. Children begin playing games again, though their games frequently involve themes of death, sickness, and loss that reflect their recent experiences. The month concludes with a staff meeting that would have seemed impossible during the pandemic's peak. For the first time since September, Boston General's medical staff discusses normal hospital operations scheduling, elective procedures, planning equipment purchases, considering staff vacation time. These mundane administrative topics represent extraordinary progress toward institutional recovery. Dr. Edmund Richards, who aged visibly during the crisis months, addresses the surviving staff with cautious optimism. "We've endured something that tested the limits of human resilience," he states, his voice carrying the authority of someone who guided an institution through near collapse. "We lost colleagues, patients, and family members. We witnessed the temporary failure of medical science to provide meaningful intervention against viral disease. But we survived, and our survival means that healing remains possible." He pauses to look around the conference room at faces marked by months of unprecedented trauma and exhaustion. The lessons we've learned about public health, about pandemic preparedness, about the social factors that influence disease transmission, must be preserved and shared. Future generations need to understand what we experienced, so they might be better prepared for similar challenges. His words carry weight because they come from someone who maintained institutional leadership during circumstances that destroyed many other organizations. The knowledge gained through surviving this pandemic, both medical and administrative, represents valuable preparation for future health crises that are certain to occur. Walking home through streets where spring snow is beginning to melt, revealing grass that has grown wild during months of municipal neglect, you feel something you hadn't expected to experience, again professional satisfaction. Not because you successfully treated many patients, but because you continued showing up, continued providing whatever comfort was possible, continued believing in medicine's value, even when medicine seemed powerless. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, as Boston begins the long process of rebuilding institutions, supporting survivors, and incorporating pandemic lessons into future planning. But tonight, for the first time in months, you sleep without the constant anxiety that characterized the pandemic's darkest period. Recovery remains fragile and uncertain, but it has finally begun. March arrives with the promise of spring and the reality of massive reconstruction. You wake to the sound of hammers and saws as Boston begins the enormous task of rebuilding not just damaged buildings, but entire social systems that the pandemic destroyed. The morning light reveals streets where cleanup crews work to remove debris from abandoned houses, where volunteer groups organize distribution of supplies for families still struggling with basic survival needs. The most visible change is demographic. Boston feels like a city with crucial pieces missing. Entire age cohorts, particularly adults between 20 and 35, have been decimated, creating a population structure that resembles a war zone more than a peacetime community. The productive heart of society has been carved out, leaving children and elderly survivors to rebuild what younger adults normally sustain. At Boston General, your daily routine now includes tasks that would have been unimaginable during normal times. Beyond treating patients, you serve on committees planning the reopening of schools, evaluating candidates for essential city services, and developing protocols for future pandemic preparedness. Medicine has expanded beyond individual patient care to encompass community reconstruction and public health planning. The hospital itself bears physical scars from months of operating under emergency conditions. Equipment worn out from overuse awaits repair or replacement. Wards converted to morgue space require extensive cleaning and renovation before resuming normal functions. Most significantly, the staff roster shows gaps that may never be filled. Colleagues lost to influenza whose expertise died with them. Nurse Margaret O'Sullivan, promoted to head of nursing after the previous administrator's death, leads efforts to train new staff recruited from other cities where the pandemic's impact was less severe. These new employees bring medical knowledge but lack experience with the specific trauma that Boston's population has endured, creating challenges in providing appropriate care for survivors. The new nurses understand basic medical procedures, she explains during a morning briefing, her Irish accent still thick despite months of exhaustion. But they don't understand why a patient might panic when asked to lie flat, or why children scream when separated from their guardians for examination, or why some people refuse treatment entirely because they've lost faith in medicine's ability to help. Her observation illustrates the pandemic's psychological legacy. Many survivors developed lasting trauma responses that affect their ability to receive medical care, even for conditions unrelated to influenza. Trust in medical authority has been shaken by months of watching physicians prove helpless against viral infection, creating ongoing challenges for routine healthcare delivery. Your morning rounds reveal the complex long-term consequences of surviving history's deadliest pandemic. The pediatric ward houses children whose physical health has recovered, but whose emotional development remains severely disrupted. Many exhibit behaviours suggesting they've forgotten how to play normally, how to interact with peers, how to trust adult caregivers who aren't immediate family members. 7-year-old Patrick Sullivan illustrates these developmental challenges. His parents both died in October, leaving him in the care of an aunt who survived influenza but remains physically and emotionally compromised. Patrick has recovered from his own mild case of influenza, but he no longer speaks in sentences, rarely makes eye contact with adults, and shows extreme distress when separated from his aunt, even briefly. He used to be such a chatty little boy, his aunt explains during a consultation about his behavioural regression. Always asking questions, making jokes, curious about everything. Now, he barely talks at all, and when he does speak, it's usually to ask if someone is going to die. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that the world isn't actually ending when his world really did end? Her question reflects the broader challenge of helping children recover from trauma that exceeds normal childhood experiences. Standard approaches to child development don't account for entire communities being devastated by disease, leaving families and institutions struggling to provide appropriate support for young survivors. The adult wards present equally complex challenges. Many patients show persistent complications from influenza infection, heart damage that makes physical labour impossible, neurological problems that affect cognitive function, chronic fatigue that prevents return to previous employment. These complications create economic hardship that extends far beyond individual families to affect entire community recovery efforts. James McCarthy, the dock worker, whose heart was damaged by viral infection, represents thousands of similar cases throughout the city. At 32, he's become permanently disabled and unable to perform manual labour that was his primary skill. His wife Mary, who also survived influenza, but with less severe long-term effects, now bears responsibility for supporting their family while caring for a husband whose health may never fully recover. "We saved money for years to buy a house," Mary explains during a clinic visit to monitor her husband's cardiac condition. "We were so close to having enough for a down payment. Now James can't work. I can barely find employment that pays enough to cover rent, and we're talking about whether to sell our furniture to buy food. Surviving the influenza was supposed to be the hard part." Her situation illustrates how the pandemic's impact extends far beyond immediate mortality to create lasting economic disruption that affects survivors for years. Communities must support not only orphaned children and elderly survivors, but also working-age adults whose capacity for productive employment has been permanently reduced by viral infection. Despite these ongoing challenges, March also brings examples of remarkable community resilience. Local churches, operating under modified protocols, begin hosting support meetings for pandemic survivors. These gatherings provide opportunities for people to share experiences, offer mutual assistance, and begin processing trauma that individual therapy cannot fully address. You attend one such meeting at St. Patrick's Cathedral, where about 50 people gather in the main sanctuary, sitting far apart but united by shared experience of surviving unprecedented catastrophe. The conversation focuses not on medical details, but on practical challenges. How to find employment when previous jobs no longer exist. How to care for orphaned relatives when resources are limited. How to rebuild social connections after months of isolation. One participant, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, speaks for many when she describes the psychological challenge of trusting that recovery is possible. "For months, we lived expecting each day to be worse than the last," she says, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who has endured too much loss. People kept dying, services kept failing, hope kept disappearing. Now they tell us things are getting better. But how do you believe that when everything you trusted before proved worthless? Her question reflects the broader challenge facing not just Boston, but communities worldwide that survived the 1918 pandemic. Institutional trust in medicine, government, religious authority, social support systems has been shaken by months of witnessing their failure during crisis. Rebuilding these institutions requires not just resuming their functions, but demonstrating their renewed reliability to populations that have learned not to depend on them. The afternoon brings news that illustrates both progress and ongoing limitations. Boston's Public Health Department announces plans to hire additional staff and expand services, but recruitment remains difficult because many potential employees died during the pandemic or moved away to communities less affected by disease. The knowledge and experience required for effective public health work cannot be quickly replaced when experienced practitioners are lost. Dr. William Woodward, the city's surviving public health officer, describes the challenge during a meeting about pandemic preparedness planning. "We're trying to rebuild expertise that took decades to develop," he explains, consulting notes about staffing needs and available candidates. The physicians who understood infectious disease epidemiology, the nurses who knew how to manage mass vaccination campaigns, the administrators who could coordinate emergency responses, many of them are gone. "We're starting over with inexperienced staff and hoping we can develop competence before the next crisis hits." His concern reflects a broader pattern affecting all professional fields. The pandemic didn't just reduce population numbers, it specifically targeted knowledge workers in their productive years, creating gaps in institutional expertise that may take generations to fill. Society must simultaneously rebuild and relearn skills that seemed permanently established before the crisis. Evening brings a personal milestone that illustrates the gradual return to normal social functions. You receive an invitation to attend the wedding of two pandemic survivors, Mary McKenna, the widow whose firefighter husband died just before their daughter's birth, and Dr. Robert Hayes, the epidemiologist who documented the pandemic's progression through Boston. Their union represents hope that new relationships can form even after devastating loss. The wedding, planned for April in a small ceremony with limited guests, symbolizes belief that the future holds possibilities beyond mere survival. These two people, who lost previous spouses to influenza and witnessed the near collapse of their community, have chosen to commit to building something new together rather than remaining trapped in grief over what was lost. Walking home through streets where gas lamps reveal the first tentative signs of commercial recovery shops staying open past dark, people gathering in small groups for conversation, children playing outside until their parents call them home, you feel a cautious optimism that has been absent for months. Tomorrow will bring new challenges as Boston continues the slow process of rebuilding institutions, supporting survivors, and preparing for whatever crises the future might hold. But tonight, you allow yourself to believe that the worst may finally be over, that healing is possible not just for individual patients, but for entire communities, and that human beings can indeed survive and recover from catastrophes that seem designed to destroy civilization itself. The long road back from pandemic devastation has begun, though the journey will require years to complete. April brings the first genuine signs that Boston might recover not just from the pandemic's immediate devastation, but from the deeper wounds inflicted on community life itself. You wake to sounds that had disappeared entirely during the crisis months. Street vendors calling their wares, children walking to newly reopened schools, the clip-clop of horses pulling delivery wagons, as commerce tentatively resumes in neighborhoods that had seemed permanently abandoned. The most remarkable change is demographic visibility. For months, the streets were empty except for medical personnel, death collectors, and the desperately sick seeking help. Now people emerge cautiously from homes where they've been isolated, blinking in spring sunlight like survivors emerging from underground shelters after a bombing campaign. They maintain careful distance from each other, many still wearing masks, but their presence creates the first semblance of normal urban life since the pandemic began. Your daily walk to Boston General takes you through neighborhoods showing mixed signs of recovery and ongoing devastation. Some blocks display evidence of resumed activity shops, with freshly painted signs advertising reopened under new management, houses with repaired windows and tended gardens, children's toys left in front yards suggesting the return of normal family life. Other blocks remain largely abandoned, their empty houses marked with official notices about unclaimed property and public health hazards. At the hospital, the most significant change is scale. For the first time since September, the facility operates as a medical institution rather than an emergency disaster center. Patient census has dropped to levels that allow individual attention rather than mass triage. Wards can be properly cleaned and maintained. Medical staff can focus on healing rather than simply managing death on an industrial scale. Nurse O'Sullivan, incredibly, continues reporting for duty despite having lost most of her immediate family to influenza. Her persistence represents not just personal resilience, but institutional continuity that proves crucial for training new staff and maintaining standards of care. When she briefs you on overnight developments, her voice carries exhaustion, but also something approaching professional satisfaction. "We admitted only 8 new patients last night," she reports, consulting notes written in handwriting that no longer shakes from overwork and stress. None with influenza symptoms. 3 surgical cases, 2 cardiac patients, 1 obstetric delivery, 2 children with injuries from playing outside normal cases that we can actually treat effectively. This return to routine medical practice feels almost miraculous after months when every patient presented with the same untreatable viral infection. Your medical training, which seemed useless during the pandemic's peak, regains relevance as you encounter conditions that respond to available treatments. The satisfaction of successfully treating patients, something taken for granted before the crisis, now feels like a professional triumph. Your morning rounds begin in the pediatric ward, which houses fewer patients but presents more complex challenges. Many children show lasting effects from influenza infection or trauma associated with family losses. These cases require not just medical treatment, but psychological support that exceeds normal pediatric practice. Child development has been disrupted on a massive scale, creating needs that individual families and institutions struggle to address. 6-year-old Sarah Kowalski illustrates the pandemic's continuing impact on child development. She survived influenza with minimal physical effects, but witnessed the deaths of both parents and 3 siblings. Now, living with an elderly aunt who speaks limited English, Sarah has regressed to behaviours typical of much younger children: bedwetting, refusal to sleep alone, extreme separation anxiety when her aunt leaves her sight. She wakes up screaming almost every night. Her aunt explains through a translator during a pediatric consultation. She calls for her mother, asks when her family is coming home, sometimes doesn't recognize me as someone safe. How do you help a child forget such terrible things? The question reflects challenges facing thousands of families caring for traumatized child survivors. Normal approaches to childhood grief don't account for simultaneous loss of multiple family members combined with witnessing community-wide devastation. These children require specialized support that few practitioners know how to provide because such massive trauma was unprecedented in peacetime medical practice. The adult medical wards present different but equally complex long-term challenges. Many patients classified as recovered from influenza continue experiencing complications that may be permanent heart damage, neurological problems, chronic fatigue, respiratory impairment. These complications create ongoing medical needs, while reducing patients' capacity for employment that might support their care costs. Margaret O'Brien, the widow whose dock worker husband died in September, represents thousands of similar cases. She survived influenza, but with heart damage that makes physical labour impossible. As a single mother supporting 3 young children, she needs income but lacks capacity for available employment. Her situation illustrates how individual recovery from pandemic disease doesn't automatically restore economic stability or family welfare. "I want to work, doctor," she explains, during a clinic visit to monitor her cardiac condition. "I have children to feed, rent to pay, responsibilities to meet. But I can't do the kind of physical work that's available to women, like me cleaning houses, taking in laundry, working in factories. My body won't allow it anymore. What happens to families like mine?" Her question reflects the broader economic challenge facing communities with large populations of survivors whose working capacity has been permanently reduced. Society must somehow support these people while rebuilding economic productivity with a workforce depleted by death and disability. Traditional approaches to unemployment assistance don't account for mass disability created by pandemic disease. Despite these ongoing challenges, April also brings evidence of remarkable social reconstruction. Community organizations, many formed spontaneously during the crisis, begin transitioning from emergency relief to long-term rebuilding efforts. Churches establish programs to match orphan children with surviving families willing to provide care. Neighborhood groups organize to support widowed parents and elderly survivors living alone. You participate in one such program, serving as medical advisor to a church-based effort to support pandemic orphans. The program attempts to place children with families throughout New England, where relatives might provide care, but the challenges are enormous. Many children require not just homes, but intensive emotional support to recover from trauma. Many potential caregivers are themselves struggling with grief and economic hardship. The afternoon brings news that illustrates both progress and limitations in institutional recovery. Boston's school department announces plans to reopen additional schools, but with significant modifications. Class sizes must remain small to prevent disease transmission. Many teachers died during the pandemic, creating shortages that may take years to address. Most significantly, many children have been without formal education for 7 months, creating learning deficits that require specialized remediation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the psychiatrist who survived influenza and established support groups for trauma survivors, describes the educational challenges during a consultation about several young patients. "These children haven't just missed school time," she explains. "They've experienced trauma that affects cognitive development, attention, memory formation. Some show symptoms resembling shell shock in soldiers' hypervigilance, startle responses, difficulty concentrating on tasks unrelated to survival." Her observation suggests that educational recovery will require more than resuming normal classroom instruction. Many children need therapeutic intervention before they can benefit from academic learning. Teachers must be trained to recognize and respond to trauma symptoms that interfere with normal child development. Schools need resources that exceed traditional educational budgets. Evening brings a community event that symbolizes Boston's gradual return to social life. The first public concert since the pandemic began takes place in Boston Common, featuring musicians who survived influenza and want to contribute to community healing. The audience numbers only about 200 people, sitting far apart on blankets and maintaining careful distance, but their presence represents extraordinary courage and hope. You attend with several hospital colleagues, sitting on grass that has grown wild during months of municipal neglect. The music's simple folk songs and patriotic tunes would have seemed unremarkable before the pandemic. Now it feels profound, an assertion of cultural continuity despite unprecedented disruption. People who haven't socialized in months risk exposure to gather for something non-essential but deeply meaningful. The concert concludes with a moment of silence for pandemic victims, followed by a hymn sung by the entire audience. The sound of hundreds of voices raised together, the first mass vocal expression since the crisis began, creates an emotional experience that transcends musical performance. It's a declaration that community can be rebuilt, that shared activities remain possible, that culture can survive even catastrophes designed to destroy social bonds. Walking home through streets where spring flowers bloom in abandoned lots, past houses where lights burn again in windows that were dark for months, you feel something approaching normal professional satisfaction. Not because the pandemic is over, its effects will persist for years, but because healing has become possible again, both for individuals and for the community itself. Tomorrow will bring new patients with problems you can actually treat, new challenges in rebuilding medical services, new opportunities to practice medicine as healing rather than simply witnessing death. For the first time since September, you look forward to going to work, to using knowledge and skills that seemed useless during the pandemic's darkest months. The signs of life returning are fragile and tentative, but they are real. Boston is beginning to remember what it means to live rather than merely survive. May transforms Boston from a city of survivors into a community attempting to rebuild not just what was destroyed, but to create something better than what existed before the pandemic. You wake to the sounds of construction hammers, saws, voices of workers, as crews repair damaged buildings and construct new facilities designed with hard-earned knowledge about preventing disease transmission. The spring morning carries scents of blooming flowers mixed with fresh lumber and paint, creating an atmosphere of renewal that would have seemed impossible just months ago. The most remarkable change is psychological. People move through streets with purpose rather than the desperate urgency that characterized the crisis months. They make eye contact with neighbors, exchange greetings, even occasionally gather in small groups for conversation that doesn't focus exclusively on death and loss. Children play games that don't involve themes of sickness and dying, suggesting that normal childhood development might resume despite the trauma of recent months. Your daily routine now includes responsibilities that would have been unimaginable during peacetime medical practice. Beyond treating patients, you serve on the city's Pandemic Preparedness Committee, developing protocols for future health emergencies based on lessons learned from the 1918 catastrophe. These meetings force you to analyze what went wrong, what worked, and how Boston might better respond to similar crises. At Boston General, the hospital operates with renewed confidence in its mission. Patient census remains manageable, allowing attention to individual cases rather than mass casualty management. Equipment has been repaired or replaced, wards have been thoroughly renovated, and new staff have been trained to replace colleagues lost to influenza. Most importantly, the hospital has implemented design changes intended to prevent future pandemic spread, better ventilation systems, isolation wards, quarantine protocols. The morning brings news that illustrates both the progress achieved and challenges that remain. Boston's Public Health Department announces the establishment of a new division of epidemic disease control, staffed by survivors who gained expertise through living through the 1918 pandemic. This division will monitor disease patterns, coordinate emergency responses, and maintain supplies of medical equipment needed during health crises. Dr. William Woodward, the public health officer who helped coordinate Boston's response to the pandemic, describes the new division's mission during a staff meeting at the hospital. "We can't prevent future pandemics," he explains, consulting notes about resource allocation and personnel assignments. "But we can prepare better than we were prepared for this one. We now understand how quickly medical facilities can be overwhelmed, how rapidly social services can collapse, how crucial it is to maintain public order during mass casualties." His words carry authority because they come from someone who witnessed the near collapse of urban civilization and helped guide the community back toward functionality. The knowledge gained through surviving unprecedented catastrophe must be preserved and institutionalized so future generations can benefit from current suffering. Your morning rounds reveal the complex, long-term consequences of surviving history's deadliest pandemic. The pediatric ward houses children whose physical health has recovered, but who continue requiring psychological support to process trauma that exceeded normal childhood experience. Many still show developmental delays, behavioral problems, and learning difficulties that suggest lasting neurological effects from viral infection. However, some children demonstrate remarkable resilience. 8-year-old Michael Sullivan, who lost both parents and lived through months of community devastation, has begun showing signs of recovery that offer hope for other young survivors. Working with volunteer teachers and receiving consistent care from his surviving aunt, he started speaking normally again, engaging in play activities and showing curiosity about learning rather than just survival. "He asked me yesterday when he could go back to school," his aunt reports during a pediatric follow-up appointment. "Not whether he could go, but when. He wants to learn to read better so he can help other children who lost their families. It's the first time since his parents died that he's talked about the future instead of just getting through each day." His recovery illustrates the human capacity to rebuild psychological health even after experiencing trauma that seems too severe for minds to process. Children who receive consistent care, educational opportunities, and emotional support can gradually restore normal developmental patterns despite witnessing events that would challenge adult coping abilities. The adult wards present ongoing challenges, but also examples of adaptive recovery. Many patients continue experiencing complications from influenza infection, heart damage, respiratory problems, neurological symptoms, but they've learned to manage these limitations while rebuilding productive lives. Their adaptations provide models for other survivors learning to live with permanent health changes. James McCarthy, the dock worker whose heart was damaged by viral infection, illustrates this adaptive recovery process. Unable to perform heavy manual labour, he's learned bookkeeping skills and found employment managing inventory for a small shipping company. His work accommodates his physical limitations while utilising intelligence and experience that weren't damaged by disease. "I can't do the work I used to do," he explains during a cardiac follow-up appointment, "but I can do different work that's still useful, still provides income for my family. The pandemic took away some things, but it didn't take away everything. I'm still alive, still able to contribute, still able to be a father and husband." His perspective reflects the psychological adjustment many survivors achieve after initial grief and despair about lost capacities. Recovery doesn't require returning to previous functioning, but rather finding new ways to create meaningful lives within current limitations. This adaptation process seems to be facilitated by community support and opportunities for productive engagement. The afternoon brings a visit from Dr. Victor Vaughan, the US Army's Chief Medical Officer, who tours Boston to study civilian pandemic response for military planning purposes. His presence reminds you that the 1,918 influenza pandemic was global, affecting not just Boston, but communities worldwide. The lessons learned here have implications far beyond local medical practice. What we've observed in Boston represents the most comprehensive civilian response to pandemic disease in modern history, Dr. Vaughan explains during a meeting with local medical leaders. The measures implemented here, quarantine protocols, hospital overflow procedures, mass casualty management, will inform military medical planning for decades. He pauses to consult notes about mortality statistics and social interventions. More importantly, the psychological and social recovery patterns we're documenting provide insights into community resilience that extend beyond medical concerns. How do societies rebuild after catastrophic loss? How do institutions adapt to survive unprecedented stress? These questions have implications for military planning, urban development, and public policy. His interest in Boston's experience reflects growing recognition that the 1918 pandemic represents more than a medical crisis. It was a test of civilization's survival capacity under extreme stress. The lessons learned have value for addressing future challenges that may not involve disease, but could similarly threaten social stability. Evening brings a community celebration that symbolizes Boston's psychological recovery from pandemic trauma. The first public festival since the crisis begins takes place on Boston Common, featuring music, food vendors, and children's activities. The event draws several thousand people, still far fewer than would have attended similar gatherings before the pandemic, but representing extraordinary courage and hope. You attend with hospital colleagues and families, participating in the first large social gathering you've experienced in over 8 months. The crowd maintains more distance than would have been normal before 1918. Many people still wear masks, and conversation frequently references recent losses. But the fundamental human need for community connection reasserts itself despite lingering fears. The festival includes a memorial service for pandemic victims, conducted simultaneously at several sites throughout the city. The service honours not just individual deaths, but the loss of community innocence about human vulnerability to forces beyond medical control. It acknowledges that Boston has been forever changed by the experience, while affirming that life can continue despite permanent scars. Children who survived the pandemic participate in activities designed to restore normal childhood experiences, games, contests, performance opportunities. Watching these young people laugh and play provides evidence that psychological healing is possible even after trauma that seemed too severe for children to survive emotionally intact. Walking home through streets where evening light reveals communities gradually returning to life, families sitting on front porches, neighbours working in gardens, young couples strolling together, you feel a sense of professional fulfillment that has been absent for months. Not because every patient recovered, but because the community itself is recovering, and medicine played a crucial role in that process. Tomorrow will bring new patients with conditions you can actually treat effectively, new opportunities to practice healing rather than simply managing death, new chances to apply medical knowledge in circumstances where such knowledge makes a meaningful difference. The pandemic taught harsh lessons about medicine's limitations, but recovery is demonstrating medicine's essential value for community health and social stability. Boston is rebuilding not just what was lost, but creating something stronger, more resilient, more prepared for future challenges. The work is far from complete, but the foundation has been laid for recovery that honours both the dead and the living. June brings the first comprehensive assessment of what Boston and the world learned from surviving history's deadliest pandemic. You wake to a city that looks superficially normal, but operates with fundamentally altered understanding of human vulnerability. medical limitations, and social fragility. The morning light reveals communities that have rebuilt not just physical structures, but entire approaches to public health, emergency preparedness, and community resilience. The most profound change is institutional memory. Every hospital, school, government office, and community organisation now includes personnel who lived through the pandemic and carries knowledge gained from that experience. This institutional memory represents perhaps the most valuable outcome of unprecedented suffering wisdom earned through surviving catastrophe that seemed designed to destroy civilization itself. Your daily routine now includes responsibilities that didn't exist before 1918. Teaching pandemic preparedness to medical students, consulting with city planners about hospital capacity, reviewing public health protocols designed to prevent future outbreaks from becoming catastrophic. These duties reflect medicine's expanded understanding of its role in protecting not just individual patients, but entire communities from health threats. At Boston General, the hospital operates with capabilities that would have seemed impossible during the pandemic's peak. Advanced isolation wards prevent cross-infection between patients. Improved ventilation systems reduce airborne disease transmission. Emergency protocols enable rapid expansion of capacity during health crises. Most importantly, staff training includes pandemic response procedures based on hard-earned experience. The morning brings a visit from Dr. Wade Hampton Frost, the epidemiologist who's documenting the 1918 pandemic for the US Public Health Service. His research aims to understand how the virus spread, why certain populations were more vulnerable, and what interventions proved most effective in reducing mortality. His questions force you to analyze experiences that were too traumatic to examine thoroughly while living through them. The mortality patterns we observed defy traditional understanding of influenza behavior. Dr. Frost explains during an interview about your pandemic experiences, the concentration of deaths among healthy adults aged 2040, the relative sparing of elderly populations, the rapid progression from initial symptoms to fatal pneumonia. These characteristics suggest we encountered a completely novel pathogen. He pauses to consult notes, filled with mortality statistics and epidemiological data. More significantly, the social responses to this pandemic quarantine measures, school closures, business shutdowns, represent the largest public health intervention in modern history. Understanding which measures were effective could inform responses to future disease outbreaks. Your conversation with Dr. Frost helps you recognize patterns that weren't apparent during the crisis. The communities that implemented social distancing measures early experienced lower mortality rates than those that delayed intervention. Cities that maintained essential services while restricting non-essential gatherings recovered more quickly than those where government functions collapsed entirely. Most importantly, communities that preserved institutional knowledge through the crisis were better positioned to rebuild afterward. These observations have implications far beyond medical practice. They suggest that pandemic preparedness requires not just medical resources, but also social planning, economic flexibility, and psychological resilience that enable communities to survive prolonged stress without losing essential functions. Your afternoon rounds reveal the pandemic's lasting impact on individual survivors and their families. Many patients continue experiencing complications from influenza infection, but they've learned to manage these limitations while rebuilding meaningful lives. Their adaptations provide insights into human resilience that extend beyond medical recovery to encompass psychological, social, and spiritual healing. Mary McKenna, the widow who gave birth during the pandemic's peak and later married Dr. Robert Hayes, represents one pattern of recovery through new relationship formation. Their combined family, her daughter Hope and his 2 children from his previous marriage, illustrates how pandemic survivors created new kinship structures to replace families destroyed by disease. "We didn't marry because we forgot our previous spouses," Mary explains, during a routine pediatric visit for baby Hope, now 6 months old and thriving. "We married because we understand how precious life is, how quickly it can be lost, how important it is to build something positive from survival. Our love honors the dead by affirming that life continues." Her perspective reflects a common pattern among pandemic survivors: the development of intensified appreciation for relationship, family, and community connection. People who witnessed mass death often emerge with deeper understanding of what makes life meaningful and greater commitment to protecting and nurturing those values. The pediatric ward presents the most encouraging evidence of long-term recovery. Children who survived the pandemic with severe trauma are gradually regaining normal developmental patterns through consistent care and educational support. Their resilience offers hope that even the most damaged survivors can recover functional capacity with appropriate intervention. 10-year-old Catherine Walsh, who lost her entire family and spent months in hospital care, has been placed with a foster family in suburban Newton. She visits the hospital monthly for follow-up care, and her progress illustrates the human capacity for psychological healing even after experiencing losses that seem too severe for children to survive emotionally intact. She started asking questions about her parents again. Her foster mother reports during a pediatric consultation, not the desperate questions she used to ask, when they were coming back, why they left her alone, but memory questions. She wants to know what they were like, what they enjoyed doing, how they met each other. She's beginning to process their deaths as permanent loss rather than temporary abandonment. This shift from denial to acceptance represents crucial progress in childhood grief recovery. Catherine's ability to remember her parents with love rather than terror suggests that traumatic memories can be processed and integrated into psychological development rather than remaining as sources of ongoing distress. The afternoon brings news that illustrates the pandemic's lasting impact on medical education and professional development. Harvard Medical School announces a new curriculum requirement. All medical students must complete training in epidemic disease control, mass casualty management, and community health emergency response. This requirement ensures that future physicians will be better prepared for health crises than the current generation was in 1918. Dr. Henry Christian, the medical school's dean, describes the curriculum changes during a visit to Boston General. "The pandemic revealed gaps in medical education that we can't allow to persist," he explains, consulting notes about proposed course requirements. "Our graduates understood individual patient care, but were unprepared for public health emergencies, community-wide disease management, or the psychological dimensions of practicing medicine during social crisis." The new curriculum will include training in epidemiology, quarantine procedures, resource allocation during emergencies, and the ethical challenges of practicing medicine when normal treatment protocols become impossible. These additions reflect recognition that physicians must be prepared not just for individual medical problems, but for circumstances where individual care becomes secondary to community survival needs. Evening brings a memorial service that illustrates how Boston has learned to honor pandemic victims while affirming life's continuation. The service takes place at Symphony Hall, recently reopened with modified seating arrangements that maintain social distance while accommodating large gatherings. The program includes music by composers who died during the pandemic, performed by musicians who survived and want to preserve cultural memory of what was lost. You attend with hospital colleagues and surviving family members, participating in the first formal community memorial for pandemic victims. The service acknowledges not just individual deaths, but the loss of community innocence about human vulnerability to forces beyond medical control. It recognizes that Boston has been permanently changed by the experience, while affirming that meaningful life can continue despite permanent scars. The memorial includes readings from journals kept by pandemic victims and survivors, providing voices for experiences that might otherwise be forgotten. One entry from a nurse who died in October 1918 captures the dedication that characterized medical personnel during the crisis. I know I may not survive this plague, but I cannot abandon my patients while they suffer. If death comes, let it find me doing my duty to heal and comfort those who need help. Her words remind the audience that survival was possible only because many people chose service over self-preservation, duty over safety, community welfare over individual protection. The pandemic revealed not just human vulnerability, but also human courage, and the capacity for self-sacrifice that enables societies to survive existential threats. The service concludes with a commitment ceremony where community leaders pledge to maintain pandemic preparedness, support surviving victims, and preserve institutional memory of lessons learned through unprecedented suffering. These pledges represent recognition that recovery from catastrophe requires not just healing, but active effort to prevent similar disasters in the future. Walking home through streets where summer evening light reveals communities that have genuinely recovered from pandemic devastation. Families gathering on front porches, children playing safely in groups, neighbours working together in community gardens, you feel a sense of professional and personal completion that has been absent since the crisis began. The pandemic tested every assumption about medicine's capabilities, society's resilience, and humanity's survival capacity under extreme stress. The tests revealed both devastating limitations and remarkable strengths. Medical knowledge proved inadequate against viral infection, but human courage proved sufficient to maintain essential services and community support systems. Tomorrow will bring routine medical practice in circumstances where healing is possible, where knowledge makes a difference, where individual patient care can proceed without the overwhelming pressure of mass casualties. But tomorrow will also carry forward the lessons learned through surviving unprecedented catastrophe lessons about preparing for future crises, supporting community resilience, and maintaining hope when hope seems impossible. Boston has rebuilt not just what was destroyed, but has created something stronger, more resilient, more prepared for whatever challenges the future might bring. The cost of that knowledge was enormous. Over 15,000 local deaths, families destroyed, communities devastated, institutional collapse. But the knowledge gained may prevent even greater catastrophes in the future. The lessons learned in blood and loss have become the foundation for stronger, wiser, more compassionate medical practice and community life. That may not justify the suffering experienced, but it honors the memory of those who died by ensuring their deaths contribute to protecting future generations. July brings what feels like the return of normal life, but it's a normalcy haunted by recent memories of mass death and social collapse. You wake to sounds that would have seemed mundane before 1918, but now feel miraculous. Children laughing as they walk to summer school programs, vendors calling their wares from horse-drawn carts. The distant sound of construction as Boston continues rebuilding damaged neighborhoods. These ordinary sounds carry extraordinary significance because they represent life reasserting itself after experiencing its near extinction. The morning walk to Boston General takes you through streets that appear superficially recovered, but bear subtle signs of recent trauma. Some buildings remain empty because entire families died and no relatives survive to claim property. Certain blocks have fewer children playing than before 1918, reflecting the pandemic's devastating impact on young populations. Most significantly, people still maintain more physical distance in their social interactions, unconsciously preserving habits learned during months when human contact could bring death. At the hospital, your daily routine now includes responsibilities that reflect hard-earned wisdom about pandemic preparedness. You serve on committees developing emergency protocols, training new staff in mass casualty procedures, and reviewing hospital capacity for future health crises. These duties ensure that institutional memory of the 1918 pandemic becomes embedded in hospital operations rather than being lost when current staff retire. The most profound change in medical practice is psychological. You and your colleagues approach routine cases with deeper appreciation for medicine's power when it works effectively, but also with humbling awareness of its limitations when confronted with diseases beyond current understanding. This dual perspective creates more thoughtful, more compassionate, more realistic medical practice than existed before the pandemic. Your morning rounds begin in the pediatric ward, which now houses children whose problems can actually be treated successfully: broken bones, routine infections, developmental concerns that respond to medical intervention. After months of watching children die from untreatable viral infection, successfully treating a case of pneumonia with supportive care feels like performing a miracle. 8-year-old Thomas Murphy represents thousands of children whose lives were permanently altered by pandemic experience, but who are gradually adapting to create meaningful childhood despite trauma. Both his parents died during the October peak, leaving him in care of an elderly grandmother who survived influenza with minimal symptoms. His resilience illustrates the human capacity to rebuild psychological health even after experiencing losses that seem too severe for children to survive emotionally intact. "I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up," he announces during a routine follow-up examination, his voice carrying the determination of someone who has witnessed both medicine's failures and its importance. Not because doctors can fix everything, but because sick people need someone to care about them even when they can't be cured. His perspective reflects wisdom earned through experiencing medicine's limitations during crisis, combined with appreciation for its value in providing comfort and maintaining hope when healing isn't possible. Children who survive the pandemic often display psychological maturity that exceeds their chronological age, having witnessed adult responsibilities and life or death decisions at ages when most children are protected from such realities. The adult medical wards present ongoing challenges, but also evidence of remarkable adaptive capacity. Many patients continue living with complications from influenza, infection, heart damage, respiratory problems, neurological symptoms, but they've learned to manage these limitations while rebuilding productive, meaningful lives. Their adaptations provide models for other survivors learning to create quality of life within permanent physical constraints. Margaret O'Brien, the widow whose dock worker husband died in September, illustrates this adaptive recovery process. Her heart damage prevents heavy physical labour, but she's learned secretarial skills and found employment that accommodates her limitations while providing income to support her 3 children. Her adaptation represents thousands of similar cases where survivors rebuilt their lives around permanent health changes rather than waiting for complete recovery that would never come. "The pandemic took away the life I had planned," she explains during a cardiac follow-up appointment, "but it didn't take away my ability to build a different life that's still meaningful. My children still need a mother, I still have skills that can be useful, and I'm still alive, when many others didn't survive. That has to be enough. Her perspective reflects psychological adjustment that many survivors achieved after initial grief and despair about lost capacities. Recovery doesn't require returning to previous functioning, but rather involves finding new ways to create purposeful engagement with life within current limitations. This adaptation process appears to be facilitated by community support and opportunities for productive contribution. The afternoon brings a visit from a delegation of physicians from European cities devastated by the pandemic, who tour Boston to study American approaches to post-pandemic recovery. Their presence reminds you that the 1918 influenza was truly global, affecting communities worldwide and creating universal challenges in rebuilding medical services and social institutions after unprecedented devastation. Dr. Henri Dubois from Paris describes conditions in France where pandemic mortality combined with war casualties to create demographic devastation that exceeds even Boston's losses. "We lost an entire generation of young adults," he explains, his accented English carrying weariness that transcends language barriers. "Our medical schools have no students because the men who should be studying medicine died in trenches or from influenza. Our hospitals have no nurses because the women who should be providing care are dead or caring for orphaned children." His description illustrates how the pandemic's impact extends far beyond immediate mortality to affect institutional capacity for decades. Professional knowledge takes years to develop and cannot be quickly replaced when experienced practitioners are lost. Communities must simultaneously rebuild while relearning skills that seemed permanently established before the crisis. The European physicians are particularly interested in Boston's approaches to supporting pandemic orphans and survivors with permanent health complications. They observe the city's modified school programs, community support systems, and medical follow-up protocols for people experiencing long-term effects from influenza infection. These innovations represent practical solutions to problems that all pandemic-affected communities face. Evening brings a cultural event that symbolizes Boston's psychological recovery from pandemic trauma, the first theatrical performance since the crisis began. The play, performed at the renovated Colonial Theatre, with reduced seating capacity and modified ventilation systems, presents a drama about community survival during natural disaster. The performance addresses themes of loss, resilience, and hope that resonate deeply with an audience that has lived through similar experiences. You attend with hospital colleagues, participating in the first large cultural gathering you've experienced since before the pandemic began. The audience maintains more physical distance than would have been normal before 1918. Many people still wear masks during intermission, and conversation frequently references recent losses, but the fundamental human need for artistic expression and shared cultural experience reasserts itself despite lingering caution. The play includes scenes depicting medical personnel treating patients during crisis conditions, community leaders making impossible decisions about resource allocation, and families coping with losses that seem too great to bear. These dramatic representations provide opportunities for audience members to process their own experiences through artistic interpretation rather than direct confrontation with traumatic memories. During intermission, conversations among audience members reveal the pandemic's lasting psychological impact. People speak more directly about mortality, express deeper appreciation for relationships and experiences that might be lost without warning, and demonstrate increased commitment to community welfare and mutual support. The shared trauma appears to have created stronger social bonds among survivors, while simultaneously making them more aware of life's fragility. The performance concludes with a speech by one of the characters that captures the psychological state of many pandemic survivors. We cannot return to who we were before the plague came, because that innocence has been lost forever. But we can become something better, wiser, more compassionate, more grateful for each day we're given, more committed to protecting and nurturing what we've learnt to value. Walking home through streets where summer evening light reveals communities that have genuinely adapted to life after unprecedented catastrophe, you carry with you a sense of professional and personal completion that has been slowly rebuilding since the pandemic's end. The crisis tested every assumption about medicine's capabilities, society's resilience, and humanity's survival capacity under extreme stress. The tests revealed both devastating limitations and remarkable strengths. Medical knowledge proved inadequate against viral infection that exceeded current understanding, but human dedication proved sufficient to maintain essential services and community support systems, even when institutional frameworks collapsed. Professional training provided little guidance for pandemic conditions, but professional commitment enabled continued service despite circumstances that made traditional medical practice impossible. Tomorrow will bring routine medical practice in circumstances where healing is possible, where knowledge makes meaningful differences in patient outcomes, where individual care can proceed without the overwhelming pressure of mass casualties that characterized recent months. But tomorrow will also carry forward the lessons learned through surviving unprecedented catastrophe lessons about preparing for future crises, supporting community resilience, and maintaining hope when hope seems impossible. The ghost of normal life that haunts July 1919 isn't the return of pre-pandemic innocence, but the emergence of a new kind of normalcy that incorporates wisdom earned through surviving what seemed like civilization's near collapse. This new normalcy honors both the dead and the living by ensuring that the suffering experienced wasn't meaningless, but rather contributed to creating stronger, more resilient, more compassionate communities. The pandemic is ending not with celebration, but with quiet determination to build something better than what existed before the crisis. That may be the most valuable outcome of unprecedented suffering. The transformation of trauma into wisdom, loss into appreciation, fear into preparedness, and despair into sustainable hope. August marks one full year since the second wave of influenza began its devastating assault on Boston, and the anniversary brings both reflection on survival and recognition of permanent changes in how you understand medicine, community, and human resilience. You wake to a city that has not simply recovered from pandemic devastation, but has been fundamentally transformed by the experience, stronger in some ways, more vulnerable in others, forever altered by knowledge of how quickly civilization can collapse when confronted with forces beyond human control. The morning walk to Boston General takes you through neighborhoods that tell complex stories of loss and renewal. Some blocks have been rebuilt with improved housing that incorporates lessons about ventilation, overcrowding, and disease transmission learned through bitter experience. Other areas remain partially abandoned, their empty lots serving as unintentional memorial gardens where wildflowers grow over foundations of houses where entire families died. The most profound change is not physical but psychological. Boston's population now includes two distinct groups: those who lived through the pandemic and those who arrived afterward. The survivors share common experiences of witnessing mass death, social collapse, and medicine's helplessness against viral infection. This shared trauma creates bonds that transcend traditional social divisions, while simultaneously creating distance from people who didn't experience the crisis directly. At the hospital, your daily practice now incorporates systematic approaches to pandemic preparedness that would have been unimaginable before 1918. Emergency protocols specify procedures for rapid capacity expansion during health crises. Staff training includes mass casualty management and quarantine procedures. Most importantly, the hospital maintains supplies of medical equipment and medications needed during epidemic conditions, ensuring that future crises won't find the institution completely unprepared. Your morning rounds begin with patients whose conditions can be treated effectively, using available medical knowledge, a luxury that felt impossible during the pandemic's peak months. Successfully treating pneumonia with supportive care, setting broken bones with confidence that healing will occur, prescribing medications that actually relieve symptoms. These routine medical interventions now carry emotional satisfaction that exceeds their clinical significance because they represent medicine functioning as intended. However, your patient population also includes many people experiencing long-term complications from influenza infection. These cases provide ongoing reminders of the pandemic's lasting impact and force continued recognition of medicine's limitations even when acute crises have passed. Heart damage, neurological problems, chronic fatigue, and respiratory impairment affect thousands of survivors who must rebuild their lives around permanent health changes. James Sullivan, the police officer who survived influenza but lost his entire family, illustrates both the challenges and possibilities of long-term recovery from pandemic trauma. Unable to return to police work due to both physical limitations and psychological effects of his losses, he's found employment with a community organisation that supports other pandemic survivors. His work provides income while utilising his experience to help people facing similar challenges. "I can't be the person I was before the pandemic," he explains during a follow-up appointment to monitor his cardiac condition. "That person had a family, a job, a future that made sense. But I can be someone useful to people who understand what I've been through. Maybe that's enough purpose to build a life on." His adaptation represents a common pattern among survivors who transform traumatic experience into opportunity for service to others facing similar challenges. This transformation doesn't eliminate grief or restore what was lost, but it creates meaning from suffering by using personal experience to benefit community recovery efforts. The pediatric ward presents the most encouraging evidence of human resilience and adaptive capacity. Children who survived the pandemic with severe trauma are gradually developing normal social skills, academic abilities, and emotional regulation through consistent care and educational support. Their recovery provides hope that even the most damaged survivors can regain functional capacity with appropriate intervention. 10-year-old Sarah Kowalski, who witnessed her entire family's death and spent months in hospital care, has been successfully placed with adoptive parents who understand her needs and provide specialized support. Her progress illustrates the importance of community resources and institutional knowledge in supporting recovery from trauma that exceeds normal childhood experience. She's started talking about wanting to be a teacher, her adoptive mother reports during a routine pediatric follow-up, not because she's forgotten what happened to her family, but because she wants to help other children who might go through difficult times. She says children need adults who understand that scary things can happen, but that doesn't mean scary things will always happen. Her perspective reflects wisdom that many child survivors developed through experiencing losses and fears that most adults never face. These children often display psychological maturity and empathy that enable them to provide unique support to peers dealing with various forms of trauma and loss. The afternoon brings news that illustrates the pandemic's lasting impact on medical education and professional development worldwide. Medical schools throughout Europe and America are implementing curriculum changes based on lessons learned from the 1918 crisis. These changes ensure that future physicians will be better prepared for public health emergencies and mass casualty situations than the current generation was when the pandemic began. Dr. William Welch, the prominent pathologist studying pandemic mortality patterns, visits Boston General to document the hospital's approaches to post-pandemic medical practice. His research aims to preserve institutional knowledge gained through surviving unprecedented crisis, so future medical institutions can benefit from current experience without having to learn identical lessons through similar suffering. The medical profession has been permanently changed by this pandemic, Dr. Welch observes during interviews with hospital staff. We've learned humbling lessons about the limitations of medical knowledge, but we've also discovered remarkable capacity for adaptation, innovation, and continued service under impossible conditions. These lessons must be preserved and transmitted to future practitioners. His work represents systematic efforts to transform traumatic experience into educational resources that might prevent similar catastrophes or enable better responses to future health crises. The suffering experienced gains meaning through its contribution to protecting future generations from similar devastation. Evening brings a community gathering that has become a monthly tradition survivor support meetings where people who lived through the pandemic share experiences, provide mutual assistance, and maintain connections formed during the crisis. These meetings serve multiple functions: emotional support for ongoing trauma recovery, practical assistance with problems related to health complications or economic disruption, and preservation of collective memory about experiences that transformed the community. You attend these meetings as both medical advisor and fellow survivor, providing health information while participating in discussions about rebuilding individual lives and community institutions. The conversations reveal both the lasting impact of pandemic trauma and the remarkable capacity for human adaptation and mutual support. One recurring theme is appreciation for life and relationships that might previously have been taken for granted. People who witnessed mass death often express deeper gratitude for ordinary experiences, family meals, friendship conversations, routine daily activities that continue to be possible. This heightened appreciation appears to create more intentional, more meaningful engagement with life among many survivors. Another common theme is increased commitment to community welfare and mutual support. People who survived through assistance from neighbors, medical personnel, and community organizations often demonstrate stronger dedication to helping others facing various forms of crisis. The pandemic appears to have strengthened social bonds, while simultaneously making people more aware of their interdependence. The meeting concludes with a ritual that has developed spontaneously, a moment of silence for those who died, followed by statements from participants about lessons learned or commitments made based on their survival experience. These statements vary, but often include pledges to support community preparedness, maintain connection with other survivors, and use personal experience to benefit others facing difficulties. Walking home through streets where late summer evening light reveals communities that have been permanently changed by shared experience of unprecedented catastrophe, you carry forward recognition that August 1919 marks not the end of pandemic impact, but a transition to living with its lasting consequences while building something meaningful from survival. The pandemic tested every assumption about medicine's capabilities, society's resilience, and humanity's survival capacity under extreme stress. The tests revealed both devastating limitations and remarkable strengths that will influence how you practice medicine and engage with community for the remainder of your career. Tomorrow will bring routine medical practice in circumstances where healing is possible and knowledge makes meaningful differences in patient outcomes. But tomorrow will also carry forward the transformation achieved through surviving what seemed like civilization's near-collapse transformation of professional identity, personal values, and community commitment that honors both the dead and the living. What you carry forward isn't just medical knowledge or technical skills, but wisdom about human vulnerability and strength, about the importance of preparation and community support, about maintaining hope and purpose when facing circumstances that seem designed to destroy both. This wisdom, earned through unprecedented suffering, becomes the foundation for stronger, more compassionate, more resilient medical practice and community life. The pandemic has ended, but its lessons will continue influencing how you care for patients, support colleagues, and contribute to community welfare for decades to come. That may be the most valuable outcome of surviving catastrophe, the transformation of trauma into wisdom that benefits not just survivors, but future generations who will face their own challenges and crises. September 1919 arrives with the crisp promise of autumn and the profound recognition that you have witnessed and survived one of the most catastrophic events in human history. Exactly 1 year has passed since the second wave of influenza began its devastating assault on humanity, claiming more lives in 12 months than the Great War managed in 4 years of industrialized slaughter. You wake not to celebration, but to quiet acknowledgement that survival itself represents a form of victory against forces that seemed designed to destroy civilization. The morning walk to Boston General takes you through a city that bears the invisible scars of mass trauma, but also displays remarkable evidence of human resilience and community reconstruction. Children walk to schools that have reopened with modified procedures and enhanced health protocols. Adults conduct business with greater awareness of interdependence and mutual vulnerability. Elderly residents sit on porches, representing the demographic group that survived the pandemic with unexpected success, serving as living repositories of wisdom about endurance and adaptation. The most profound realization is that you are no longer the same physician who first encountered influenza patients at Camp Devens in March 1918. 18 months of witnessing medicine's complete helplessness against viral infection, followed by gradual recovery of professional competence as the pandemic subsided, have fundamentally altered your understanding of healing, suffering, and the role of medical practice in human society. At Boston General, your daily routine now includes responsibilities that reflect permanent changes in medical practice and hospital operations. Emergency preparedness has become integrated into routine planning rather than an afterthought. Staff training includes pandemic response procedures that were learned through bitter experience. Most importantly, the hospital maintains institutional memory of lessons learned through surviving unprecedented crisis, ensuring that future generations of medical personnel will be better prepared for similar challenges. The morning brings news that illustrates the pandemic's global impact and the universal nature of recovery challenges. Mortality statistics from around the world confirm that the 1,918 influenza pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people, more than 3 times the death toll from the World War that was ending as the pandemic reached its peak. These numbers represent not just individual tragedies, but the near collapse of social systems economic structures, and cultural institutions throughout the world. Your medical practice now serves patients whose lives have been permanently altered by pandemic experience, but who demonstrate remarkable capacity for adaptation and continued meaningful engagement with life. These survivors represent living testimony to human resilience and the possibility of rebuilding purpose and connection, even after experiencing losses that seem too great to bear. Mary McKenna Hayes, the widow who gave birth during the pandemic's peak and later married the epidemiologist who documented the crisis, brings her daughter hope for a routine pediatric examination. The child, now 14 months old, represents new life emerging from the darkest period of recent history, carrying forward genetic legacy while starting fresh, without direct memory of the trauma that shaped her birth circumstances. She'll never remember the pandemic directly, Mary observes, while watching her daughter play with simple toys in the examination room. But she'll grow up in a world that was changed by it, with parents who were shaped by surviving it. I hope we can give her the benefits of what we learned, without burdening her with the trauma of how we learned it. Her reflection captures a central challenge facing all pandemic survivors: how to integrate devastating experience into ongoing life in ways that promote growth rather than perpetuating trauma. The wisdom gained through surviving catastrophe must be preserved and transmitted without imposing the emotional weight of that experience on people who didn't live through it directly. The pediatric ward presents extraordinary evidence of children's capacity for psychological healing even after experiencing trauma that would challenge adult coping abilities. Young survivors who lost entire families, witnessed community collapse, and lived through months of uncertainty about basic survival have gradually restored normal developmental patterns through consistent care and educational support. However, many of these children also display characteristics that distinguish them from peers who didn't experience the pandemic: greater empathy for others' suffering, deeper appreciation for ordinary security and routine, stronger commitment to helping people in need. These characteristics suggest that surviving trauma can contribute to character development that benefits both individuals and communities, though at costs that no child should have to pay. The afternoon brings a ceremony that illustrates Boston's commitment to honouring pandemic victims while affirming continued life and community rebuilding. The dedication of the Influenza Memorial in Boston Common provides permanent recognition for the more than 15,000 local residents who died during the pandemic, while creating space for ongoing community remembrance and reflection. You attend the dedication with hospital colleagues, city officials, and hundreds of community members who survived the crisis. The memorial consists of a simple granite monument inscribed with dates of the pandemic waves and general mortality statistics, surrounded by gardens planted with flowers that bloom throughout the year, ensuring ongoing beauty and life in space dedicated to remembering death. The dedication ceremony includes readings from journals kept by pandemic victims and survivors, providing voices for experiences that might otherwise be forgotten as time passes and memories fade. These readings remind attendees that statistics represent individual human lives, each with unique stories of love, loss, courage, and suffering that deserve to be remembered and honoured. One journal entry, from a nurse who died in November 1918, captures the spirit that enabled survival for many while claiming the lives of others. I may not live to see the end of this plague, but I refuse to let fear prevent me from doing what I can to help. If we abandon caring for each other, we lose something more important than individual lives. We lose what makes life worth preserving. Her words remind the audience that survival was possible only because many people chose service over self-preservation, community welfare over individual safety, hope over despair, even when hope seemed unjustified by circumstances. The pandemic revealed not just human vulnerability, but also human capacity for courage and self-sacrifice that enables societies to survive existential threats. The ceremony concludes with a commitment by city officials to maintain pandemic preparedness, support surviving victims, and preserve institutional memory of lessons learned through unprecedented suffering. These commitments represent recognition that recovery from catastrophe requires not just healing, but active effort to prevent similar disasters and support ongoing community resilience. Evening brings a personal milestone that symbolizes your own transition from pandemic survivor to practitioner, carrying forward lessons learned through crisis. You receive notification of appointment to serve on the American Medical Association's new Committee on Epidemic Disease Control, established to develop national guidelines for pandemic preparedness based on experience gained during the 1918 crisis. This appointment represents recognition of expertise gained through surviving unprecedented medical emergency, but also responsibility to ensure that knowledge earned through enormous suffering contributes to protecting future generations from similar catastrophes. Your experience treating patients when treatment seemed futile, maintaining hope when hope seemed irrational, and continuing medical practice when medicine seemed powerless must be translated into practical guidance for practitioners who may face similar challenges. Walking home through streets where September evening light reveals communities that have been forever changed by shared experience of mass trauma and collective recovery, you carry forward recognition that this day marks not just the first anniversary of the pandemic's peak, but the emergence of new understanding about medicine, community, and human resilience. The pandemic tested every assumption about medical capabilities, social stability, and civilization's survival capacity under extreme stress. The tests revealed both devastating limitations and remarkable strengths that will influence medical practice and community planning for decades to come. Medicine learned humbling lessons about its limitations, while also discovering extraordinary capacity for adaptation and continued service under impossible conditions. Tomorrow will bring routine medical practice in circumstances where healing is possible, where knowledge makes meaningful differences in patient outcomes, where individual care can proceed with confidence in professional competence. But tomorrow will also carry forward permanent changes in understanding about preparedness, community support, and the crucial importance of institutional memory in preserving lessons learned through catastrophic experience. The new dawn rising over Boston in September 1919 illuminates not just a city that survived unprecedented crisis, but a community that has been strengthened and made wiser through surviving what seemed designed to destroy it. The cost of that wisdom was enormous. Thousands of deaths, families destroyed, institutions collapsed, innocence lost forever. But the wisdom gained offers the possibility of preventing similar catastrophes in the future, or responding more effectively when such crises inevitably occur again. You have witnessed the darkest pandemic in human history and emerged not unscathed, but transformed. As a physician, as a community member, as a human being who understands both vulnerability and resilience in ways that were impossible before experiencing civilization's temporary collapse and gradual resurrection. That transformation, multiplied across thousands of survivors, becomes the foundation for stronger, more compassionate, more prepared society that honors both the dead and the living by ensuring their suffering contributed to protecting future generations. The pandemic is over, but its lessons will echo through your practice and your community for the rest of your life. That echo carries both the weight of loss and the promise of wisdom, the most valuable inheritance that can emerge from surviving history's greatest catastrophe. And so ends our journey through the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919, as seen through the eyes of a doctor who lived through humanity's darkest medical hour. We've witnessed the collapse and resurrection of civilization, the failure and renewal of medicine, the devastation and resilience of the human spirit. This wasn't just a story about disease. It was about what happens when everything we take for granted disappears overnight. When hospitals become morgues, when children lose entire families, when communities must choose between economic survival and public health, when medicine itself must confront its own powerlessness. But it was also about the extraordinary capacity of human beings to endure, adapt, and ultimately triumph over circumstances that seem designed to destroy everything we hold dear. Through 18 months of unprecedented catastrophe, people continued showing up: doctors, treating patients they couldn't save, nurses caring for the dying, teachers planning for futures they weren't sure would exist, parents protecting children in a world that had become terrifyingly dangerous. The lessons learned in blood and loss became the foundation for modern pandemic preparedness, public health policy, and medical education. The survivors of 1918 created the frameworks that helped future generations respond more effectively to subsequent health crises. Their suffering was not meaningless. It became the wisdom that protects us still. Today, as we face our own global health challenges, the voices of 1918 remind us that civilizations can survive even the most devastating pandemics, that communities can rebuild from seemingly complete collapse, and that the human spirit possesses reserves of strength and compassion that reveal themselves only under the most extreme circumstances. Thank you for listening to this story of survival, loss, and ultimate renewal. If you found value in this journey through history's most challenging pandemic, please like and subscribe. The voices of those who came before us deserve to be heard, remembered, and honored through our continued commitment to protecting the communities they fought so hard to preserve. Their dawn became our foundation. Our vigilance becomes the legacy we leave for those who come after us. Number the Spanish flu, a doctor's journey through history's deadliest pandemic.